Hello, this is Brian. Today is a beautiful, warm December 2nd, 2020. It's a Wednesday, and I want to present a spotlight video today. It's not going to be a spotlight on a tree, it's going to be a spotlight on a shrubbier plant called the white sage, Salvia apiana. So this is white sage right here. So, first interesting thing I have to note is, how do you classify white sage? Well, it looks like a bush. Most people just look at it and say, oh, it's a nice looking bush. But there are a few things that complicate this a little bit. For instance, white sage starts out very herbaceous, like your common garden sage and a lot of other plants. They start out very herbaceous, and then they grow and develop a shrubby habit, and then they start forming wood once they're well established. So, a lot of people consider them to be herbaceous perennials, long-lived perennials. They live for quite a while. Some consider them to be sub-shrubs, which are woody-based, smaller stature than your woodier shrubs, and then some consider them shrubs. So, leaving that somewhat vague description in mind, we will call, for the purpose of this video, we will call them sub-shrubs to shrubs. Like I said, they start out very herbaceous, and most of their top tissue is herbaceous, and then they develop wood towards the base of their stems. So white sage, it's a very common plant where I am in the Santa Ana Mountains. We're about 3,100 feet above sea level. Very common, especially on south-facing slopes, dry slopes. Very heat tolerant, very drought tolerant, and it is a member of the mint family, the Lamiaceae. So white sage is characterized by these glaucous, nearly white-colored leaves. And that is much more prevalent during the dry season. They reflect a lot more sunlight, and therefore they retard excessive water loss. Because we're in a very dry area. We're on a south-facing slope. Well, we're kind of level here, but this becomes a south-facing slope, and it's very sun-exposed. So it dries up much more quickly, and these plants are very well endowed with the ability to withstand dry heat. So, white sage is the foliage portion of the plant is generally fairly low growing, maybe up to a few feet tall, as you can see here. But then you notice these big long sticks sticking up from the base. These are what become the flowers and then the fruits, the seeds. And they can grow far taller than your head. I'm about 5'7" in height, 5'7", 5'8", between that. So I would say this is probably about 6.5 feet tall. That's not uncommon for white sage to send up flower or inflorescence stalks that reach far over your head. And these are the old spent inflorescences from the previous years. And in more recent ones, you can see you can see where the seeds are housed in these little fruit-like things. And the seeds are these little nutlets that are supposed to be very nutritious. So white sage is very common here in Southern California. However, there are some areas where it's not very common, and in some areas where it's the most common sage, most common salvia. And we got several species of salvia here in Southern California, most of which are very similar, sub-shrub to shrub, and then with a few herbaceous species, perennials, and even a couple of annual species. So where I am is in one of the highest concentrations, probably the highest concentration I have personally seen here in the Santa Ana mountain range. I am parked along Long Canyon Road, and I'm just below Blue Jay Campground, where Blue Jay Campground is, which is just over the hill over there. So this area along Long Canyon Road has an immense, huge stand of white sage. In fact, that's the dominant plant along this slope right here. You can see other shrubs like laurel sumac, these guys here, laurel sumac and other chaparral and sage scrub plants. But then you see these grayish color, that's a whole slope covered in white sage. So it's covered in these guys. So there are a couple of pretty interesting things. Well, there are a lot of interesting things about white sage. This plant is revered as a salve. And it's also it has a very spiritual connotation, this plant. So this is the plant that a lot of people use for smudge sticks. They light sage. If you hear them, they think they're going to light a smudge stick of sage and try to cleanse the air. Well, it's because the plant and its resinous properties are great for cleansing the air, and is also used as cleansing the spiritual air. So if you gently rub a leaf, you barely even have to touch one of these. Gently rub it and you sniff it, it has a very pungent smell. This is one of the most pungent species of sage here in Southern California. In the description, I'm not sure the whole entire range of this plant, but when I put up the description, I'll expound on its range more specifically there. But here in Southern California, you're going to find this plant a lot, especially in coastal sage scrub and in openings in chaparral and sometimes in meadows. Drier meadows, upslope from moisture spots, because like I said, this is a very dry tolerant plant, and it likes to be drier rather than wet. So I was talking about earlier, they use these to purify the air and sometimes use it as a way of decontaminating the air and also cleansing the spiritual air in their smudge sticks. I believe this plant has also been used as an herb for seasoning, though I don't know how it would taste. I would assume it would probably be pretty bitter. I've never tried it, and I would do more research about that before attempting to use any wild plants for culinary purposes. But I believe this plant has been used for seasoning. I imagine it would add quite a strong punch to anything you season, because this is an extremely aromatic plant. Now, so I was telling you, these plants start out herbaceous and then they develop woody bases with age. So I'll show you an example of that. Since we're kind of in the dry season, the plant is generally hardened off. It's lost a lot of moisture during the course of the summer, but the top here, the tip, is herbaceous. But then if you go down lower, then you start getting into a brittle, very brittle portion here, and then towards the base it's woody and it has kind of a gray furrowed bark. So let's go down, and then kind of a shreddy furrowed bark. So this is the bark of white sage. It's light gray, not unlike a lot of the other species of sage, and it becomes a lot more strongly woody with age. I wouldn't doubt that these plants can live for decades, because I've seen some white sages with some large trunks. Let's see if I can find some pretty good examples. Well, here we are. This right here, let's see. Actually, that's a sagebrush trunk. But you can see here how they start off nice and soft and herbaceous. This plant right here is mostly herbaceous. Hasn't developed any wood yet. This one's starting to develop wood. You can see the base of the trunk there. This one is more mature, so it has woodier tissue. You see the stem down here is more woody. It's got bark. I'm trying to see if I can find any with some very large trunks that I can show you without standing in the middle of the road like an idiot. Let's see. Sometimes you'll see these develop some pretty gnarly trunks. I've seen it before. I mean, that first example I showed you was pretty decent indication of it. Well, here's one that had died some time ago. This is an old white sage. And you can see they do develop some pretty interesting trunks. So you can see, it's kind of hard to see because it kind of mixes in with the rock, but they do develop some pretty decent sized trunks. And you see, they love these south-facing slopes. Here's an old one that had died some time ago. Look at how all this right here is part of the stems where they join the dirt. Basically where all the stems meet. That's an old trunk. That's an old trunk of white sage. So, when it comes to flowers, white sage is mostly a spring and early summer bloomer. It depends on your elevation. The lower elevations, they tend to flower earlier, sometimes as early as March or April, and then sometimes as late as July in higher elevations. Elevation range for white sage. It's basically found in quite a wide variety of altitudes. Right now, like I said, we're a little above 3,000 feet, and it's very common and prevalent. As you can see, this whole slope here and this slope here completely covered in white sage. But basically it ranges from sea level to above 5,000 feet. I have seen it above 5,000 feet in elevation. I've seen it, the highest I've seen it so far is about 5,400 feet near Booker Hill, on Booker Hill in Palomar Mountain State Park in San Diego County. It does have a wide elevation range. Now, after reading books and doing research, white sage is not known to produce high quantities of viable seed, especially in dry years. So it usually takes a really good rainy season for them to produce a higher percentage of viable seeds. And according to Fred M. Roberts and Robert Allen's Wildflowers of Orange County in the Santa Ana Mountains, there's been quite a decline in the distribution and abundance of white sage. You wouldn't know it being here near Blue Jay Campground because it's all over the place. It's over there too on that slope as well. But apparently the plants are not setting seed as much. A lot drier years, and apparently with all the disruption, a lot of the bees, the species of bees that pollinate the flowers, a lot of times they need old wood to bury and nest in, are maybe losing in abundance as well. So maybe they're not getting pollinated quite as much, and of course the dry years mean much less yield in seed. So it could cause trouble for this plant in the future, especially as more land is torn up for building, and more land means less habitat for pollinating animals, which is a shame. So if we're talking about the flowers are kind of a whitish to palish pinkish, maybe slight tinges of bluish. They're quite small. They're your typical mint family flowers, and they're on these big long stalks. They send these long stalks up in late winter, and then by spring these things are covered. And what does the name apiana refer to? Well, it basically deals with bees, because it comes from the genus Apis, A-P-I-S. Apis is bee in Latin, and honeybees are in the genus Apis. Apis mellifera is the honeybee. So it's very much a bee plant. Bees love it. It's understandable. They have very nectar-rich flowers, and I would imagine that the pollen tastes pretty nice to the bees. But what can I say? White sage, extremely awesome plant. You can find it in coastal sage scrub, chaparral, interior sage scrub. You can even find it nearing the desert as well. You can find it from sea level to well over 5,000 feet. Not sure if it quite gets to 6,000 feet, but if I find it at 6,000 feet, there will be documentation, as I like to document that kind of stuff. It's a very sacred plant, especially to the Native Americans, and even people who came after the Native Americans. Rituals, air cleansing, and also to me it's a good mood booster plant, because the smell of it heightens my feeling of well-being. Being around it puts me in a good mood, let's put it that way. Again, white sage, Salvia apiana. Probably you don't have to go far to find it. You can find it from near the ocean to basically the edge of the desert. And you can find it under oaks, you can find it under pines, and you can find it in very barren landscapes like this. So that's it. Salvia apiana. Take some time to go out of your way to appreciate the white sage. One last note. I always end up doing this on my spotlight videos. I always end up thinking of something towards the end when I want to conclude, but we're talking about the color of white sage. Well, white sage, you can see, has more of a whitish in the green, more like a whitish green. During rainier periods and moister locations, you can see the green a lot more clearly. During the rainy season, the leaves become more of a minty green. Still very light colored, but more of a minty green. So when the rainy season finally gets underway, these plants will become more green. And it's very common for a lot of plants that'll kind of become off-colored during the dry season. It's another adaptation to reflect all the excessive solar radiation around here. Well, that'll basically do it. Thanks for watching, and take some time out to appreciate Salvia apiana, the white sage. Thanks for watching. See you on the next video.